Just a little bit about my background. So this is where I currently see my call to serve the church, is this intersection of church and technology, walking alongside congregations to define what it looks like to imagine mission and vision in the context of digital tech. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and you may hear my 17-month-old jumping up and down around upstairs. I'm sure my wife's having a great time. When I came downstairs for this call, she was throwing cloth diapers everywhere she possibly could. You see, I'd worked really hard this morning to fold about 40 cloth reusable diapers very neatly in the laundry basket. And the minute she got home from daycare, she started just throwing them absolutely everywhere. Now, commitment number 2 that I come to this conversation with is that because technology is something that acts on culture, we really ought to come at this conversation by thinking about digital values or the shared values of our tech-shaped culture. And so the way I arrived at these was through kind of an analysis of our most widely used digital technologies to see what all of those platforms had in common. And I did a number of whiteboarding exercises and read through a lot of documentation kind of about what our most widely used technologies do. And in a sense, they kind of do 4 things. They give us the ability to ask lots of questions and to sort through many different answers. They give us the tools with which to collaborate online, offline, and asynchronously and synchronously. They give us the ability to connect in new and emerging ways. I refer to that as hybrid connection. And they give us the tools to create, to tell our own story. And when I think about those conversations that I had in the Google lunchroom with my coworkers, oftentimes the conversation turned towards what they had found unpalatable about Christian community, or what they perceived Christian community to be about. And they would tell me about how, well, if you go to church, it's a place where you hear proclamation and in this one way teaching and preaching, whereas their experience growing up in this tech-shaped culture led them to prioritize asking questions. They would tell you that they perceive the church to be an institution that's focused on hierarchy. They're more accustomed to real-time and equal collaboration. Being enthusiasts of brunch and fantasy football, they would tell you that their in-person experience of church didn't appeal to them. Working in the tech industry where everything always has some kind of a digital plugin, they would talk to me about the importance of online options to connect with the same experience. And lastly, they would tell me that they didn't necessarily want to participate in something that felt passive, that felt like a sit and get experience. As the YouTube generation that grew up with the tools to create and share one's own story, they are interested in creativity and constructing and learning through doing. So that's why I wrote Grace and Gigabytes, is to think about not just the way church is perceived by those who are young and techie and working at places like Google, but to think about what it might look like to take the unchanging gospel message and the 2,000-year-old Christian tradition and not necessarily realign it with these 4 cultural values, but find the points of overlap that already exist and really bring those into being. Because I don't think questions, collaboration, connection, and creativity are somehow unique and distinctive from the church's tradition. I think if anything, they're foundational to it, if we can cut to the core of where those things are to be found. Now, the last commitment I come to this conversation with is this idea of digital minimalism, which is simply the idea that nobody can possibly keep up with all of the technologies in our midst. We should only use those technologies that are crucial to our mission, vision, and values. I'm a big fan of the work of Cal Newport, who is a Georgetown professor of computer science and has built quite an impressive career, I think, explaining why his field of computer science gets it wrong. His most recent work is a book about reimagining work without email and work without Slack. But Cal Newport's whole idea is we should use technology as a tool to serve our purpose. We should never seek to have our purpose be to serve technology. So that's just a little bit about where this work originates from and kind of the perspective that I approach this work with. With that in mind, I just want to tell you a few things about where I see church moving. So in some of my recent work, I've been thinking about the history of the Christian tradition in three eras. Era one, if you will, from 1517 until about March 12th, 2020, was the church we were, or the analog church. It was defined by these synchronous, analog, and building-based connections. And because of the connections that brought together people at the same time in the same place, it was particularly good at equipping individuals for lives of faithful service. One of the statistics I find remarkable, and I talk about it every chance I get, is people spend very little time comparatively with religion. Even the average church member only spends about 8.4 minutes per day, on church or faith-based activities spread out across an entire week. That data is from the U.S. Census Bureau. But what we find is that through those 8.4 minutes, church membership is a catalyst for all kinds of great things, for engagement in our community, for volunteering, for philanthropy, for enacting our faith for service for the sake of the neighbor. When we look at different sociological perspectives on church and those often minute, seemingly trivial little conversations that used to happen within our buildings, what we find is that those weak ties, those passing connections, provided us with opportunities to enact our faith. They were the means with which we created a pathway to discipleship. Now, when we look at the church we were, there were also some things that weren't always going particularly well. This is a snapshot of some data that shows growth in technology usage among various generational cohorts. And I share this with you because it suggests that technology usage isn't just something that's unique to young millennial Google employee types, but is something that can be found across all generations. Those who are currently in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are actually the fastest growing segment of digital technology users. Earlier today, I told the story of my grandma. I'll tell it again if you weren't with us earlier. My grandma passed away at the age of 83, and I describe her as an avid Instagram power user. Before she passed away, she learned how to post photos to Instagram, add videos to stories, comment using emojis, even send her 9 grandkids messages using Instagram's messaging platform. At 83 years old, she represented not an anomaly, but really a trend. And as I was walking through the halls of her retirement community, I noticed she wasn't the only one taking pictures with her grandkids and sending them out to her friends. Now, when we look at the world of the church and the church we were, we see a fairly similar pattern of I don't want to say disinterest, but deprioritization of the digital world. About half of churches didn't really have a website prior to COVID-19. There's data that suggests that fewer than 5% of all churches were consistently live streaming their services prior to March of 2020. Now, the church we became at approximately 11 a.m. on March 13th was distinctive from the church we were because it was primarily web-based. And because it was web-based, it was accessible and inclusive to many. There's data about how 50% of churches experienced an increase in attendance simply by being accessible and invitational, streaming their worship in digital spaces. I think that the church we became perhaps had the challenge of not having those building-based momentary connections that were so important to Christian communities, that were so important to providing opportunities to enact our faith. One of my favorite statistics that's been identified from these past 14 months is that 11% of religious nuns, those who have no involvement with their church, those who are very much the Google employee types, felt their faith strengthened during spring of 2020 and during the pandemic, because they found that there were new inroads that they could make with Christian communities that aligned with and connected to their lifestyle. Now, I just want to share one more perspective, and that's on the church we will become. The church we will become has to find a way to build a bridge between these two concepts: the ability to equip individuals for lives of service with the ability to be inclusive, accessible, and invitational. That balance of being both digital and analog, of being neighborhood-based and web-based, is what the future of the church is all about. I have this image here of the word saint and sinner upside down and right side up. I don't have an amalgam for what it would look like if it said this, but the hybrid church is that blend of equipping and connecting, or to put it in some kind of form of an equation, the in-person connections that equip combined with the online connections that invite is what constitutes the hybrid church. I find it's helpful to think about it this way, because when we think about it through this lens, hybrid ministry, or the church's digital future, becomes a bit more purposeful. When we think of the hybrid ministry as just adding the online to the offline, or being online and offline at the same time, what we're giving ourselves is a to-do list more so than a purpose, and likely setting up our pastors for having to do the same work, only more of it. So my question for all of you that I wanted to start with, and I'll stop sharing here so we can have some face-to-face conversation, is how are you thinking about some of these challenges and opportunities as you think about coming out of this time of digital distribution or physical distancing? What challenges come to mind? Staffing, resources, energy, anything like that? And also, what are some of the opportunities you see for your ministry?
Collaboration is what I'm so excited about.
Yeah.
Not just with neighborhood churches, but around. So I've already been doing that during the pandemic. So that's good, but I look forward to doing that with more. And I want to shout out that I saw Pastor Cheryl. Pastor Cheryl must have baptized your child. Is that right, at Good Shepherd?
No, Pastor Cheryl?
I was a pastor at Good Shepherd for 3 years in Madison. So.
Oh, okay. What years were you there?
2005 to 2008. And they were my sponsor congregation for going to seminary. So.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Yeah. Small world. Yeah. I'm a member at Good Shepherd, and just joined when I moved to Madison in 2016. So good. Relatively new member there. But what a small world.
Lutheran world. Too connected.
I would echo what Amy said, because I think collaboration is key. Even before the pandemic, the pastors in my conference began to form a parish for collaboration. And we used the pandemic as a way to launch a lot of what we could do in person at some of our social justice ministries while we were separated physically. So my own church called our weekly food distribution our worship, because that's what we could do together. And then we broadcast worship weekly to be together with people. And our geographic boundaries grew during that time beyond our own immediate neighborhood. But likewise, I had people from like Linda Taylor's here. There were people from her church who'd jump into my worship, and people from my church who would jump into other worships in the area, just to get ideas about how other churches were doing stuff and share connections and see familiar faces. So that collaboration that allows us to join together in new and different ways is really critical. I also visited a church recently that was doing a hybrid where because we were still in the orange tier at the time, they were meeting outside on the roof of their church and having a Zoom function. So we had breakout groups. The people live had a breakout group there during the time that would be like our passing of the peace. And those of us on Zoom in our own locations were in our own little groups so that we could have some connecting time. Some of that, if you, as I think you called it, casual conversations or minutia that people would share, we had that time even in a hybrid situation. So that was something that's energized my community about doing hybrid church, because we're highly interactive in the way we've been doing church during this Zoom time and always were before that.
Yeah. So just to respond to a few of the things I heard there, that's a really interesting dimension of collaboration that I had not even thought about. The idea of collaboration across congregations. And when I've spoken with more rural synods, they've described similar collaboration opportunities where smaller parishes have
idea of taking the tires off
experiences. So that it's really interesting to hear basically two of you now say that that's been an important part of the Southern California Synod's experience navigating these last 14 months is collaboration at the congregation level and collaboration at the level of the individual parish.
I'm just going to answer something about a question I see here about people who are.
You know what, Marcia, I want to ask that of Ryan. I promised Ray that I would read the question. So, but I also do want to hear Ryan talk more about collaboration that's within your own congregation, like as a way of functioning. So in the chat, Ray asks, what are the best ways for a congregation to reach those who are too poor economically to afford internet access or sufficient end user equipment? Because libraries are closed on Sunday, and sometimes that's the only place they can gain access, and may not be able to afford a mobile phone. And I know that, Marcia, your congregation has a great deal of home, people experiencing homelessness, and we have several congregations in that context, but everybody seems to have a phone. So I'm not sure if that's true for everybody here or not, or what Ryan would say.
What I found is that the issue isn't as much the access to having a phone as the access to connecting to some form of internet once you have the phone, because if you're in a lot of our people who are experiencing poverty have access to Wi-Fi because it's been put in for the school district. But the people who are experiencing homelessness and in shelters and bridge facilities have not been told how they can access that Wi-Fi. The facilities themselves are not providing it to them. So we've created a separate class for the people who are experiencing homelessness, who are shoved into shelters during this time. But a lot of our parents of kids who have school or grandparents have gotten a phone and used the cellular connection they got through their government phone, government issued and government paid phone, to connect with our worship through Zoom. They just download the app and go.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's so I think that's an incredibly important question. What's interesting is that when you talk to both urban and rural synods of the ELCA, there is a similar question at work here. When you go and talk to like Intermountain, Mountain West synods or synods that have congregations in Appalachia, the question is not always is sometimes related to poverty and sometimes related to equitable internet access. But at the end, it all ties back to the question of equitable internet access. And so, at one level, having a consistent digital presence for a faith community allows accessibility beyond Sunday morning. And one of the blessings of just streaming content and hosting it to a church's Facebook page is that somebody, when the library does reopen, will have access to it. Now, that's not sufficient, and it still creates this feeling of outsiders that have to feel like they're watching a recorded experience, which isn't great. And so I've sometimes wondered aloud if that isn't part of the church's call to be an advocate for equitable internet access moving forward as a public good. That's you really can't. I think from a Christian vocation standpoint, can you really live out a calling to serve your neighbor who is online and lives online if you yourself aren't in some ways online? So it's an interesting question to consider. I really need to make a note to email the Lutheran Office of Public Policy here in Wisconsin and see what they have going on this at the state level. But Marge, do you want to comment on that for California?
Well, no, I just know that Biden just announced that that would be a part of his next issues would be equitable internet access. Other countries have it, and so it puts us behind.
Yeah. Wisconsin is the most politically divided, arguably the most politically divided state in the country right now. 2016 and 2020 were both decided one way by 20,000 votes and I think 60 to 80,000 votes in this last election. But there seems to be some bipartisan interest in equitable internet access, both for those experiencing poverty and for those who are in rural areas as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as an expression of the church's public witness, because just like we don't want to keep our doors locked to keep people out of our buildings, we don't want to have an experience where somebody can't find our digital door because they don't have access to the web.
Yeah, Marcia just posted something about California, so you can read that.
Thank you.
I just also wanted to mention creativity too, that just seems to be so much fun with this whole thing this year. I mean, many of you have heard my stories too, but like I've been doing a Bible study with my dad. He's in a church in Minnesota. So every Thursday we do that and all year long. So his congregation, my congregation, and all the congregations he's had before join in. And we've had speakers from Germany coming and talking to our church about, Protestantism in different time zones and things and whatever. But I mean, just the creativity that we've been able to have. I look forward to more of that. I had a youth worker as well. We have the money for one, but we don't have anybody we could find in person. So we hired a youth worker that was virtual this year. It's not ideal for kids, but it worked. It was wonderful and it helped me out a lot. So I'd like more creativity ideas, more ideas.
Well, and that's a good segue because, and I mean, Ryan hinted at that at the beginning, but the 4 sections of the book are about questioning things that have adapted and changed as we moved into tech-shaped culture. The idea of how people learn and what purpose questions serve, connection, collaboration, and creativity. And they all really do sort of layer on each other, don't they?
Yeah, certainly. Amy, what you just named there is that experience of cross geographical collaboration, like long distance collaboration in the church, is incredibly interesting from like a faith formation standpoint, because while previously you might only be able to bring in those teachers who are within a reasonable drive of your congregation, suddenly your congregation has access to a much wider pool of teachers. And
like Ryan from Wisconsin.
Like me from Wisconsin. But I think that is a really important concept. So, for example, in Wisconsin, we tend to have very racially homogenous, ethnically homogenous churches. It's, I come from a congregation in Appleton where if it wasn't 100% white middle class, it was very, very close. And so I think our part of us, just broadening our understanding of what God is up to in the world needs us to expand the teaching voices that we're bringing into the conversation. And the web creates that opportunity for us. In places like, for example, Appleton, Wisconsin, it's difficult to sometimes bring in the voices we need and want to be part of the conversation, because Appleton, Wisconsin is kind of a remote place for a lot of folks. So I'm particularly interested in this from an equity, diversity, and inclusion standpoint as well, because we just bring in more voices to the conversation. And as Amy points out, dealing with time zones is particularly tricky. And you all on the West Coast probably deal with the challenge of nobody really ever knows what time it is in California. Everyone always thinks it's like 1 or 2 hours past or earlier than it actually is. Just this day, I twice Googled what time is it in California, just to make sure I didn't show up for this call late.
Well, it's your dinner time and ours is tea time.
There you go.
I guess I wanted you to talk again about the collaboration within congregations and the idea of questions and how they shape
Sure.
worship and teaching and everything else.
Well, the idea of collaboration is really based on, in a digital age, it comes from these technologies that predispose us to real-time and asynchronous collaboration. Your Google Docs and Zoom create these forums where we live in these forums that are spaces for active participation and collaboration. And in the church, our tradition is the priesthood of all believers and liturgy, which is the work of the people. The idea of collaboration is central to who the church is and what the church is called to be. The question for ministry in a digital age as it pertains to collaboration is, how can we truly live into liturgy as the work of the people, regardless of where and when the people are gathered? When the pandemic struck and a lot of churches had to close their buildings, there became this shared sense of innovation with worship leadership roles. People were able to participate in worship leadership who couldn't be present in the same building at the same time on Sunday morning. At one point, I went in on a Tuesday afternoon to record the readings for that coming Sunday. I was the virtual lector for that Sunday, and I think that was a particular Sunday where I was on a camping trip with my family. There was another Sunday where the interim bishop from another synod preached a sermon to our congregation from a lake house in northern Minnesota. And so that is collaboration right there. It's taking the work of the people that is liturgy and broadening out who is involved in leading liturgy. Shared the statistic earlier today that 38% of Americans work on Sunday mornings. It's hard for them to participate in the liturgical experience if in some way we don't use technology to broaden it out a little bit. So when we look at the church's digital future, my hope is that as we return to more analog and building-based experiences, we can continue to find opportunities for virtual worship leadership, for lectors and prayers and cantors, perhaps even preachers who can contribute to the service without having to be present in the same building at the same time in the same place. My grandma at age 83, her last 3 years, she couldn't make it to her home church because her retirement community was 45 minutes away, because there were 7 steps that you had to walk up to get into the sanctuary. And because even if you went through the narrow elevator that could take your motorized scooter into the sanctuary, the scooter didn't fit down the center aisle. It's a pretty small central Wisconsin church. My grandma was someone who for years was involved in reading and lay preaching at her church. And I just wonder how much richer her final few years might have been had she been able to continue in that. Hybrid ministry gives us that opportunity. And so I'm looking forward to seeing just how the experience of collaboration continues to evolve, even as we start to bring things back into the building.
So maybe we get back to that your question about challenge as I think about the congregations that are here. What do you see as your challenges to move forward?
Well, there are 2 that come to mind. So the first one that's probably at the top or back of everyone's mind is, how do we manage to do all of this at the same time? It's a question of just time and energy from a church leader standpoint. And that's part of the reason why it's so important to create, if not collaborative structures that support the church's hybrid future. Having a volunteer schedule to support someone who runs the video and the sound and the streaming, then at least to have some kind of technology within your context that makes this work a little bit more sustainable. The pan tilt zoom camera, for example, is an excellent resource because it can be mounted to the front of a sanctuary, and with one or two clicks on an iPad, stream your worship service without having someone sitting at the camera the entire time. So that's the first challenge is just how do we create the energy to do this? March?
What was the name of the camera? I want to put it in the chat.
It's a pan tilt zoom.
Pan tilt?
Pan tilt zoom, otherwise known
Pan
as
tilt. Okay.
PTZ camera. And I was actually doing some research on this earlier today. There's a number of great articles about using pan tilt zoom cameras for worship live streaming. I've used these in the corporate world where we'll have a training session happening in some training room. It's broadcast to Zoom. There's multiple pan tilt zoom cameras. You can touch a button to change the angle and change the settings of where the cameras are positioned, even change the lighting. So that's a great way to sort of automate some of the administrative burden that goes into creating a hybrid worship experience. Yeah, usually known as a PTZ camera.
Okay. Eric asked about I lost the question because it hit up. What you think of live streaming versus like Zoom worship?
Pre-recording versus live streaming is a really interesting question. So when we look at these 14 months of physical distancing and not being able to be in the same building, I almost think it didn't matter as much which one of these two you picked, so long as you just did something.
Right.
Now, when we move into this hybrid experience of church, where we want to build a bridge between the online and the offline, where we want to create the shared experience of the work of the people around the liturgy, I tend to think that live streaming is a better option for that, simply because it provides more opportunities for collaboration. If you have a pre-recorded service a year from now, then that pre-recorded service is a buffered experience exclusively for the online viewer. That's not to say that that's a bad thing. In fact, for some churches, it might be a necessity, perhaps because it's more feasible or there's just greater comfort with it. But the challenge of pre-recording is it doesn't allow for multiple perspectives. It doesn't create that bridge. When you look at live streaming, you also have the choice of 3 different platforms, basically Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. Zoom is by far the best platform for creating collaborative experiences, for introducing more voices and more perspectives. When you use YouTube and when you use Facebook, you can do some of those things. It's just more difficult and often requires some third-party software along the way. So to answer your question, Eric, I would bet that live streaming is going to be where the future of digital worship is headed. And of those 3 platforms, there's a lot more space for innovation on Zoom, even if there hasn't been, even if most churches have been using Facebook and YouTube so far.
Well,
yeah,
and you mentioned before that, having somebody who's ready to watch the chat so that they can interact with it in real time is important too, right? Because if it's live streamed, you can't then sit and watch and add to the chat.
Precisely. So the experience of worship is actually not all that different from a production standpoint than the experience of a really well-run virtual meeting. Having somebody as a producer who can monitor the chat and raise comments and questions and observations, or in the context of worship, raise prayer requests and share prayer concerns. So every church is going to have a slightly different structure as far as staffing and volunteers go for Sunday morning. But you might imagine that many churches will have a video/video production role, as well as a production role that's responsible for actually getting the feed, getting the video connected to whatever live streaming service is utilized, and also doing things like monitoring the chat, passing along those comments.
So a couple of comments. One would be that what I like about your book is that at the end of each chapter, you have, well, not the only thing I like about the book, but one of the things I like about the book is that at the end of each chapter, you have no tech, low tech, and high tech ways of using that. And I think for a lot of our congregations, Facebook Live or a Zoom meeting is about the top of the tech level, and to talk about having a producer or somebody, I know you're talking about collaboration and training of volunteers, but it sounds overwhelming.
It certainly can. Chelsea, did you have something you wanted to respond to there?
I do, just because I think the word producer is scary to some folks. And so I always encourage my team to consider themselves hosts or like cruise directors. I like that phrase personally, but that's just a very on-brand thing for me. So I don't like the techie part, but I like the human interfacing part. So I'm going to be explaining to people how to put their prayer requests in the chat, and then I read them aloud for collective corporate worship. Or I'm going to be explaining how to go into the breakout room and what our activity is going to be or what have you. And then I have other humans who never want to be on camera and don't want to be off mute and don't want their voices heard, but they know how to run the OBS, which Marcia dropped in the chat. It's a studio platform and software, or know how to connect my live to Facebook. So, or know how to show the slides. So they do that part. I think it's about acknowledging who in our communities have those giftings, and maybe working with other folks who don't. Yeah. If
collaboration, like even within your parish or within your conference, like if your congregation doesn't know how to do this, how do you reach out, and to whom? But Sharon Richter makes a really good point. Singing and music on Zoom sucks.
Yeah.
It's just, is there a new way out of that?
Well, my people, I have some professional musicians in my church, and so they've found settings and things like that to really make a difference. And so we actually haven't had a problem. So
yeah, but people can't hear each other sing.
Yes.
You can
you're
publish music that sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Though I know a couple places that would be lovely if they would learn that, but you can. But we're still singing by ourselves in our living room.
Yes, that's true.
Or not singing.
Well, we always make sure that there's a voice recording on the music so that people at least hear that going on correctly. Yes. Yeah. But I have the people who are in the business that can do that for me. So I could share that with other churches. That's where my collaboration could be, to share my musicians.
Right. And looking at the ones on the screen, I think a lot of people have really strong musicians. But yeah, so we can share that. I think it's the whole sort of corporate piece. And Sharon, you can speak for yourself. I'm sorry, I'm talking for you, but was there some other aspect of that question you wanted to raise up?
No, you did it.
The question of music and singing together is vigorously defended as something that it belongs to the analog church in the book, The Analog Church, Why We Need Real Things, Real People, and Real Places Right Now. Excellent resource. And it's, if my book is at one end of a spectrum, which is advocating for the church's continued innovation and presence in digital spaces, the book The Analog Church is at the far end, or far opposite perspective, but they're both really useful books to read right now, because they'll show you, what the limitations are of both of those spaces. So I recommend picking that book up as well. Ray asked a question about the best means that provides a landline telephone interface. Zoom does support a dial-in experience. When you create a Zoom call, you you can set up, and I think in many cases it's automatically set up to include a dial-in over landline. So that's probably where I would start, Ray. Have you thought about that, or are you looking at maybe something that goes beyond that? Yeah, the link emails also include the dial-up phone numbers.
Yeah, they have them down there. I'm just not sure that people are noticing them. Okay, here he goes.
Marcia has commented it would be great to have a shared library of music from churches, to have service and empowerment of the whole community rather than just a music program. Yeah, absolutely. The level of collaboration in music across different congregations, I think has been pretty impressive. Here in Madison, there are two pretty big Lutheran churches that have excellent musicians, and they've been sharing music with smaller congregations in the South Central Synod of Wisconsin throughout this time who maybe need some special music right now. Eric asked, what are things you're seeing or have experienced outside of worship where churches are effectively incorporating more online interactions? Yeah, Eric, I'm glad you asked, because there's so much more to this conversation than just worship. Not just worship, but there's so much to this conversation. First of all, my mind goes towards faith formation and the education work that we do. When we think about worship, we got to think about building that bridge between online and offline. When we think about faith formation, the question is how to curate digital resources that then feed into some kind of synchronous, constructive, shared learning opportunity. So creating or sourcing different content, sharing it out on social media, and then bringing groups together to discuss, to create, to envision something together. What we see a lot in the world of adult learning is the shift towards giving learners the information, the content ahead of time, and then using the time everyone's to get together for active creation. And I think with faith formation, it's not going to be much different. The time that we're together isn't going to involve much lecture. It's not going to involve someone sitting and telling. It's going to involve debate, discussions, service projects, and other concrete expressions of the Christian faith. So there's a lot more to that can be said there, but I think that idea of faith formation, after you turn past worship, faith formation, I think is the next place to consider. Amy mentioned the confirmation students, and confirmation is often this experience where for 3 years, youth come to church every Wednesday, and that's great. I've been a part of confirmation programs where you sit down, you listen to the youth pastor for 30 minutes, you listen to the pastor for 30 minutes, and then you play your silly game, and you're out and you're on your way. The confirmation programs of the future might take more of the curriculum that's part of confirmation, put it into podcasts, put it into videos, put it into TikTok, and then get the confirmation kids together to practice those things. Gave an example earlier of a church here in Madison that created their confirmation curriculum entirely with digital video and podcasts this year, and then would bring together kids for service retreats where they learned about practicing their faith through acts of service to the neighbor in the form of creating masks and sharing those masks with hospitals who needed them, and creating thank you cards for frontline workers in the community. All kinds of interesting things that can be done there.
I want to get John's question on here too. How should our sense of community change with remote participation? I think that's key. And we heard a little bit of that, like the integrating of the online and on-site people. How do you, you can have breakout rooms for one and physical breakout rooms for the other, but then they don't interact. So
yeah.
Well, their idea of community.
So I think the question of community is shifting, is becoming detached from the concept of membership. We used to have this idea of membership that your community is your membership. Community is going to become a more fluid concept that is centered around those who are gathered together around the word and the sacraments. That's going to be ever changing, and those who are part of a community may be parts of a community for a short time or a very long time. Cultivating community becomes about encouraging engagement and creating sufficient hospitality to make those connections happen. It becomes less about cultivating long-term involvement with an institution. So the concept of breakout rooms specifically shows that there are challenges in creating virtual community. It's impossible to make community connections with the 150 people that might show up to a Zoom call. But it was also, I guess, perhaps impossible to create that community with everyone that walked through the doors of our church building. So I guess it's a long way of saying community is changing. It will become more transitory. It will become online and offline based. And when we imagine what the future of church community will look like, it'll probably be a lot more fleeting and momentary than we currently imagine or might like to imagine. There's some cool ideas floating out here about speaker series, talent shows, different ideas to use the talent in the context. Excellent. Other ideas? Other questions?
I don't have a question. I just was on another call once, and the speaker pointed out that she had been going to the same church forever and sitting next to the same person, but didn't really know them very well because she was a single woman and this person was also a single woman. And when they started doing Zoom church, she said, it's intimate because you're seeing into each other's rooms.
Right.
I mean, now I know what John's den looks like or whatever, right? I mean, I know these rooms, and she's an African-American woman in a fairly white Episcopal church. And the person that would always sit near her was a white woman who decided to ask her about racism one time, like in a chat, like because she felt like they'd been pairing up, and she kept getting in her group. So she was just daring to ask some questions that she had not dared to ask in the 10 years they'd been sitting near each other in worship. So I just thought that was interesting too. But we only have a couple more minutes, so I know y'all have other questions, and the chat's been really good. But sort of final remarks or questions from anybody? What did you want to get out of this that we didn't talk about yet?
I love the fact that we've been doing some of the things that Ryan's talking about, but I've been inspired about new ideas. I work in an unusual context that we are bilingual at least twice a month, and on midweek services and on special holidays. So we've been able to find ways to make it work better online than we were doing in person, because we had get more immediate feedback through chats and stuff. So I like that. I'm looking forward to trying some more new stuff as we go forward. And I like the idea of the multiple cameras, because we do a check-in at the end of worship now that we're trying to envision how that works with hybrid church, so that people online and in person are all in the room together to check in with each other at the end of worship, to make sure everybody hears from everybody. Because if my community is nothing, they are interested in each other's lives.
I think it takes going outside of the church as well, though. Like, look at how teachers are doing it right now, and see how they're, I've been talking to my high school daughter. How is your teacher doing things? And so getting ideas from them as well to be creative.
And they're very creative. Sharon, you had your hand.
I was just going to say, it's kind of silly, it may be, but I'm going on vacation next week, and my son, who is a pastor in Michigan, is going to preach for me. So it occurs to me, this is in the online format. You can do that. But it occurs to me, we made a deal that I will preach for him when their baby is born, right? And So what's going to happen to our poor people between calls and a waiting call who won't have supply preaching anymore? Just throwing that out there.
Well, it has been weird, I mean, because normally Synod staff is asked to preach in different places more often than we have been lately, because people have been bringing friends in from other countries and cities and having them preach, so it's fun to visit and see. But yeah, we have to figure out how to be neighborhood contextual as well as online and physical, like together, so we don't forget our actual neighborhood.
That's true.
Correct. Yeah, that's the both and aspects of hybrid ministry, and that's why this isn't something we'll figure out in the next 2 months, and then our buildings will reopen and we'll be done with it. It'll be if this is our purpose, to be both equipping and inviting, we'll be continuously living into both of those calls. Just to leave you with 2 resources here, I'll put my email address in the chat. If you have specific questions you want to ask later on, I certainly welcome those. All of this can be highly contextual, so sometimes just questions about specific details, feel free to email me at any time. I also included a link to a course I'm teaching through Luther Seminary's Faith Lead program, and it's going to focus on a little bit more of a deep dive into worship, faith formation, and church leadership, as well as some of the change management practices associated with the movement towards more hybrid forms of ministry. So that's going to be about 8 to 10 hours of asynchronous and synchronous learning spread out across 3 weeks, starting the last week in May. Anyway, it was so nice to meet all of you. I always close these by saying, it's always remarkable to think about the agility and the innovation and just the spirit-filled energy that has been part of the church leadership for the last 14 months. So blessings to all of you as you continue to lead us into the church's new normal.
Thank you, Ryan. I put a couple more things in the chat that got separated by other people putting things in the chat, so they don't make a lot of sense. But if you go to the, I'm bad with the space bar, evidently. Livingtheresurrection.com is our Synod's website for blogs and things on vitality. And I posted a blog about David Dalbert's presentation last time, and I'll write something up about this one too. Also, University of Southern California, USC. I only have to say University of Southern California to people that are like from South Carolina, but anyway, they have a Center for Religion and Civic Culture. So USC, I think it's USC/.CRCC, and they have a whole area called Reimagining Religion and a subset called Thriving Congregations, Innovation and Technology, and they'll have all the resources that they've gotten from people, and some of the folks that Ryan has quoted before, Helen Campbell and things are all on there. So great resources for everybody. And if you want to have other conversations, just tell me. We can figure out how to do this again with other people or with Ryan again, whatever we want.
And Zoom certainly always makes that possible.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to meet you.